Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next in our series of TDevConf speaker interviews. This morning we have with us Mr. Jeremy Likness from Microsoft. How are you, Jeremy?
I am doing fantastic, although I'm staring at a window full of haze because we are inundated with smoke right now. But
Oh, that's right. It's coming all the way up there. Wow.
it is. I mean, visibility's down to just a few hundred feet, so it's
Wow.
pretty crazy.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna speak with Jeremy in just a minute, but first of all, I do want to give a quick shout out, and I've got to get my screen set back up for that again because we had some technical difficulties at first. There we go. So TDevConf is sponsored. You can go and see these sponsors on your own at tdevconf.com/sponsors.html. But the ones that we have logos for right now, so we have Microsoft, which is Jeremy's employer, JetBrains, O'Reilly, and Result Group. I believe they are out of Nashville. These companies have generously donated either services that we're going to use to help make the conference awesome. They've donated swag or prizes that we're going to raffle off. And some have also made contributions to charity. Last I checked, we have raised over $400 for Vets Who Code. So go check out our sponsors and let them know how much you appreciate their support. So, Jeremy, I've got a question that we can talk about whatever you want, but I've got one question I'm asking everybody. What is the 60 to 90-second elevator pitch about yourself?
Developer for life. I'll do it in 3 seconds. I've been passionate about coding my entire life. Spent most of my time on Microsoft technology stack, so it's fitting that I ended up working at Microsoft. And my focus is really line of business, web-based applications. And right now my role at Microsoft is as a .NET Data PM. So I'm dealing with the experience of connecting to data from .NET and all of its aspects. And the only other thing I'll add is I love to hike. And so that's my 30-second elevator pitch. I have a lot of experience coding, and I love doing it.
You say, excuse me. You say you have a lot of experience coding. How did that start? What was your first computer?
Oh my goodness! So very first computer was a Texas Instruments TI 99 4A. So that was
me too. Finally,
yeah.
You're the first one who's actually we've had the same first computer.
Oh really? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, 32 column screen. I think it was 32K of memory. Maybe it was 64. I think it was less than that though. And so I remember I was home alone. We had no games for the computer, but there was a manual, and the manual said if you type in this, then you'll get this. They called it Mr. Bojangles, and it was really just a few pixels moving on the screen. But when I typed that in and hit run and saw what it produced, I was hooked from that point on. I said, this is what I want to do. I can think of something, type it in, and make it happen. And that was in the late 80s. And then I moved quickly from that to a Commodore 64. And now, we don't even really get too caught on the brand or make a model of our machine. We're more interested in platform and operating system now. But back in those days, there were dozens, right, of different types of computers with architectures and software and operating systems and whatnot.
Well, great minds think alike because I also went from the TI 99 4A to the Commodore 64. And you're talking about the amount of memory. I actually, if I'm not mistaken, the TI 99 4A had 16K of RAM. And the reason why I remember that is because one year for a birthday or Christmas or something, I got TI 99 4A Advanced Basic. And it was a cartridge that had those cartridges that were about the size, and put that in there. And that gave you extra commands, some extra colors also, I think. And also it doubled the memory to 32K. And that was a really big deal. Yeah.
Can fit a lot extra in that extra 16,000 kilobytes.
It was years ago, I was watching an interview with one of the creators of Pitfall, the Atari game Pitfall. And he was talking about, we only had 8K to fit the entire thing on. I think it was 8K. He said, and that includes the graphics and the sounds and everything. So those old things were, those old video games. Those, they're primitive by today's standards, but they were works of art back then.
They were very
Yeah.
much.
So now you may be biased because of your employer on this next question, but what's your favorite code or text editor?
My favorite code or text editor, definitely Visual Studio Code.
Yeah.
Hands down. And that was before I came to Microsoft. I was a early adopter, and every time I use it, even today, just the way it's engineered, the fact that I can open a new file that I haven't worked with before, and it automatically detects, oh, hey, this is a such and such technology. This extension may be interesting. Then you install the extension and you get all the tools for it. It's just it's designed in a way that's very easy to use, and it's what I go to for quick editing, small programs, demos, etc. If I'm building a large scale application, I'm still in Visual Studio, but for everything else, it's definitely Visual Studio Code.
Again, great minds think alike. I'm right there with you. The thing that I really like about Visual Studio Code, outside of the fact that adding extensions to it does not really slow it down, but I work across Mac and Windows. I switch back and forth daily, and the user experience, the developer experience between both, it's almost identical. I mean,
right.
Microsoft has really. I mean, this is what I mean. I really think it's one of the greatest things to come out of Microsoft in the last maybe decade. It really is, and I'm a Python guy, the Python support is absolutely fantastic. Number one extension is Python, so that's really, really awesome.
Yeah, it's nice to see the push to make all languages and platforms first-class citizens of the development tools. I think that's a huge change that's happened recently, and it's working well.
No, I completely agree. In fact, I remember when it was Visual Studio Connect, I believe it was 2014, when they announced that what eventually became .NET Core, and I was actually supposed to speak at a conference that day, and I got sick and had to pull out. And I thought, well, I'll see what Microsoft's going to do today, and then turns out that game that Scott Goo goes out and shocks the world, and we're open sourcing .NET and supporting it on other platforms. Like, whoa,
right?
What's going on here? Yeah, that's a big one. So how would you? So like you said, you've done a lot of things, and now you're, I think you said you're a data PM at Microsoft. Explain your job in terms that an elementary school student could understand.
Oh, elementary school student. Been a while since I've talked to an elementary school student. I hate to admit this, but well, actually, I should embrace it. I'm a grandfather, so my grandson is just starting kindergarten. But if I was explaining to him what I do, I would tell him that there's things that people talk about, information, facts, things like when you go to the store and you look at products, there's, mom and dad have to pay a certain amount for it. They have certain things. So what my job is to do is to handle the systems that keep track of all those things. And I make it easier for people who are building solution. Well, yeah, that's not going to go with elementary school, but yeah, make it easier for people to keep track of things through the set of tools that I provide. So just like a carpenter might use a saw or a hammer or a nail, we use computers to keep track of items and move items around and figure out things and make decisions. And that's pretty much what I'm focused on. That probably was not the best elementary school description, but
well, I mean, there are some things. I mean, I think it would be more of a challenge for me to explain machine learning to an elementary school student.
Sure.
So, without leaving them with the false impression that machines are actually intelligent. That would kind of be the challenge, I think, with explaining machine learning, which is one of the big things I'm into. Let's move on to what you're going to be talking about at TDevConf. So the title of your talk is Inside iQueryable, the Power of .NET Expressions. And I must admit, and actually I see Chris Gardner from Huntsville, Freestyle Coder, in the chat. Your interview, and then Jeremy Clark's interview tomorrow night, and then Chris's interview on Wednesday. I'm a little bit intimidated because you guys are doing, you don't burrow into the details. You all dive headfirst, perpendicular at a 90-degree angle to the details. When I was doing the schedule, I'd never done a conference schedule before, and I didn't realize how painful it was. But but I made sure not to put y'all not to put y'all three in the same slot. But why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about?
Absolutely. So it's interesting because when we started on our computers, they were so limited in resources that people had to come up with creative ways to use it. And some of the elegant software from back in the day was software that exploited defects in the manufacturing. So there would be machine instructions that weren't official instructions, but they would have these side effects that people could figure out, and it would save time, and they could use it to create tricks like putting graphics where graphics weren't supposed to go, make new colors, etc. So that really set the stage for how I approached software and explored it. But I remember a key moment, and this will segue into the talk and why I'm giving it, when Windows Runtime came out for Windows 8. And I was with a mentor of mine, and he was a co-founder of the consulting company WinElect that I worked for. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people may know him, Jeffrey Richter. He wrote CLR via C#. And we were looking at a piece of software, and I said, oh, yeah, the documentation says this thread does this. And he said, yes, but never trust the documentation. He said, we're going to debug this, and we're going to flag these threads, and we're going to track what's actually happening. And it turns out it was behaving differently than how it was documented. And we were able to overcome a problem that if we had just trusted the docs at that time, then it would have been an issue. And that really set the stage. He said, basically, if you want to provide quality software at a certain level, like let's say it's a web software, you have to really understand what's one layer beneath. So I don't have to understand machine code on the computer, but I should understand the CLR and intermediate language and everything happening. So when I joined this new role as .NET Data PM, one of the products that I work with is Entity Framework Core. Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, the ability to use C# classes and write link queries and have them translated to the database. And the way it does that is through expressions. So I said, you know what, to be effective on this team and really understand what's going on, I need to be as much of an expert on expressions as I can be. Plus, I just love software and coding. I'm in sort of a program manager role. So the mainstream part of my role is not writing software, but I do it still to keep my skills fresh and to be part of the open source community and to learn things. So I went down this journey for expressions. I think expressions are amazing. I've been using them for a long time. And I realized that a lot of people might run a link query and just have no idea of all the elements and building blocks that go behind it. And understanding that may help them do things like write better queries using Entity Framework Core because they understand some of the limitations and things going on behind the scenes, but also just build better software in general because there's a new tool to add to the toolbox. So the purpose of this talk is to really start with a simple link query and then work backwards and talk about what's really happening, how extension methods allow you to do the chaining, that it's really just a bunch of methods with parameters, that the output from the previous method is the input to the next method. And then it uses expressions as these building blocks. And I like to look at expressions, think of them as blocks of code that are highly performant, but instead of up here at the C# managed language level or down here at the intermediate language level where you're practically writing assembly, these building blocks are in the middle. They actually perform quite well when they're compiled, not as well as native code, but not as poorly as, for example, I did a benchmark on newing up something using Activator Create Instance, which is a reflection tool built into the runtime, versus using an expression that is compiled to create a new instance, and it's orders of magnitude faster. So that's what the talk's about. It's about an exploration of starting with a query, peeling back the layers to understand what's beneath it. So hopefully at the end of it, someone will at least say, oh, okay, I understand a lot more about what's going on behind the scenes and know those points of interest to dig in a lot deeper if they need to.
So let me ask you this then. What would somebody take away from the, I mean, you said people would be able to see under the hood, but what would people take away from this if they're all, let's say that they're already using expressions? what would they take away from this that would allow them to write even more performant code?
Yeah, so I think they're going to potentially understand things about expressions that they didn't understand before. Possibilities. Really, the goal is to give someone a new set of tools to add to their toolbox and to be able to do things like, I'll just give an example. Let's say I'm unit testing a view model that creates a query. The traditional way to do this might be to mock up a database and pass it through and do this and that. And people may not realize it's possible if really all the view model does is takes a queryable and adds filters and sorts and things like that to it. You don't even have to mock the database. You can intercept that query, look at the expression tree, and just say, did the view model apply an order by, or did it apply a sort, and things of that nature. And what I like to do, typically, there's so much body of knowledge. There's so many people who have been working with this for a long time. I came at this with a more naive approach, and I like to go as deep as I can without being biased by looking at other sources, with the hopes that maybe I'll uncover some idea, some strategy, some approach that people haven't thought of before that they can connect to from the presentation as I reveal the details of how I dug into this.
So again, our friend Chris in Huntsville is in the chat, and he's asking, are you going to go all the way? I assume that's a typo, down to IL?
Yes, the plan is not to go quite that deep. I'm going to go just above the surface of IL. I will mention it because the nice thing about pretty much anytime you have a language or vocabulary for describing things, I think it makes things scale well. So the reason why so many people like using Entity Framework Core is because if you've used it on one project, it's familiar on another project. If you've used it on one database, it's familiar on another database. So besides all the features and functionality and things it does, it creates a familiarity and a common ground for people. So when I look at expressions, I think of them in a similar way. It's like a common set of building blocks. And there are tools that if you really want to optimize performance, you can take some input, turn it into a set of expressions, and these tools will actually compile the expressions down to IL. I'm not going to show that or get to that level, but I am going to get to the point of explaining that with this building block, there's a lot of possibilities that you can do with it.
I think the reason that Chris is asking that question is because he's doing a talk about demystifying the .NET runtime, and I think he does dive into the IL. So,
well, yeah, I mean, diving into the IL, especially when async and await came out the first time, that was bread and butter for me learning what was actually happening. I really got it when I looked at the IL that was generated and understood how it's setting up a state machine and seeing what the syntactic trigger does. Expressions are that too. They're one of those killer pieces of functionality, that's not just a library, but actually has language integrated features, right? It's called language integrated query, but you have things like you can do expression func of T and give it a lambda expression, and all you see is the lambda expression, but behind the scenes, the compiler actually knows how to turn that into a set of expression statements that actually build an expression behind the scenes, which is pretty killer.
So you talk about the talk is called inside of iQueryable. Now, the other day I was on stream and we were talking about something and I was doing a Python stream, and somebody brought up to me and I was doing some, I forget exactly what I was doing. However, somebody in the room who was a C# coder said, I could do this in just a few, I could do this really quickly with LINQ, and showed me a web link with a K, to a project called PyLinq, Pylinq, and which is basically claimed to be a reimplementation or partial reimplementation of LINQ in Python. Now, I'm not sure how up you are on Python, but what it would do is it would take like a Python list, which is basically the same thing as a JavaScript array, and wrap it inside of an object, because Python doesn't have interfaces, called IEnumerable, and then you would call all of your I guess I should say mimicked LINQ methods off of that. So why could you go into a little bit of everybody knows what IEnumerable is. Probably the second most interface, to only to IUnknown. But what's the difference between IEnumerable and iQuery? IEnumerable and iQueryable, rather.
So what iQueryable does is iQueryable sets up a template that delays IEnumerable. What I mean by that is it allows you to set up a set of conditions. So you have your where clause, your sort by clause, your order by, etc., that it builds an expression tree, which is a set of building blocks that make decisions. So, for example, if you say where date created is less than date time now, add -7 days. Pretty simple when you think of it, where daytime, whatever. But that actually decomposes into, at the very top level, you have a call to queryable where, and that takes an input of whatever data source that you have, which could be a list, could be a database or whatever. And it takes an input of an expression that defines the where clause. Well, that expression has a parameter on one side, which is that created date. On the other side, it now has a binary expression that's making a decision, is less than. On the left side of that binary expression, we have date time now. So that's a method call, add days -7. That method call has a parameter of -7 on the right side, so on. And so it builds this tree out without actually doing anything with the data. So think of it as just an expression builder that you're using the LINQ syntax. Then when you use one of the extension methods like toList, to count, when you're turning it into actual data, even as enumerable, so you can enumerate the results, then that expression tree is compiled and run against the source. So this is why I can use the exact same syntax to look at a list of objects in memory, like an array that I create, as well as execute a command in the database. Because what Entity Framework Core does is it just takes that same set, it's the same expression tree, but Entity Framework Core takes that expression tree, translates it so that some of the things that are normally like looking at objects in memory are now turned into SQL statements that are passed to the database, and so forth. So that's the difference. IEnumerable is just a set of entities that have some sort of mechanism for iterating. And behind the scenes, it might be just an array, so the index is incrementing. It could be a stack, so it's popping off the stack. iQueryable sets up a template for an expression tree that's applied against it, and you have to take some action for that expression tree to quote unquote activate. And then deferred execution. That's why I can do a million things to set up a where and an order by or whatever. But the instant I do toList or first or single or count, then suddenly everything's compiled and executed, and that's when the magic happens, so to speak.
Yeah, that's kind of what I suspected. Something like that is that the package that we were playing with, the PyLink package that we were playing with, was more just a facade that mimics the LINQ API, as opposed to actually a re-implementation of LINQ.
Right.
Yeah, I thought because Python has a lot of things already built in that will do sort of the same thing, that are built into the language, kind of like LINQ is built into C#, but
right.
But they look ugly. they look it's much uglier than LINQ. And also it's not very C# like. It's just but no, that's kind of what I suspected. So that sounds like it's going to be this sounds like it's going to be for somebody who really wants, like I said before, wants to really dive head first. I think Chris put a comment earlier in the chat that said swan dive into the details.
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So outside of speaking at TDevConf, and I'm sure that you are a sought after speaker and contributor and such. What else do you do to make the community awesome?
There's a few things. One of the big passions that's taken up a lot of my time lately is actually a side project to learn more about expressions, but with the ultimate goal of providing a tool to make it easier for developers to actually connect to data from clients like Blazor WebAssembly. So I won't get into too many details of that. I had an exciting moment over the weekend where the end-to-end that I set as a goal, basically the goal is in a Blazor WebAssembly app to do something like query, where, sort by, etc. with LINQ, And then instead of having to parse that and turn it into a data object and call a web API, just say to list async, and behind the scenes have that query serialized, sent to the server, executed, but also in a secure way. So it's not allowing you to do things like execute program.run or things of that nature. So that's been a passion of mine. So open source is something that I'm focused on. As far as the community at large, I mentor certain people on the side. I'm open to mentoring. So anyone listening to this who's interested in that, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and we can talk about that. It's just, we figure out time commitments, do a lot of writing and blog posting and getting that information out there. And really, my philosophy is I like to try things out and find the rough edges and then share the experience of polishing those rough edges. And sometimes people have figured out how to polish it that same way, which is fine. Sometimes it's a fresh approach that helps people solve problems. So I would say the bulk of my community work, besides getting out and speaking, is daily I try to reach out to Twitter and people with questions related to data, Entity Framework Core, Spark for .NET, another product I work with, respond to that, answer blog posts, and part of what I'm starting to ramp up on too is finding like Slack channels and discussion forums and being more active of a participant in those.
Now you just mentioned something there that caught my attention. Spark for .NET.
.NET for Spark, actually. I flipped it. Yeah.
Okay. .NET for Spark. Go ahead. Could you tell us a little bit about that real quick?
Sure. So out of the box, Spark itself is a distributed engine for processing big data. And big data is kind of one of those thrown around terms. It's actually, I like it as a term because it describes exactly what it is, right? It's a lot of data. But basically with Spark, what you can do is build things called data frames that are insights into your data and manipulate the data, aggregate the data, apply machine learning models. There's a lot of steps you can take to transform data. So the idea is you have a massive amount of data, and on the other end, you either want to, as part of the process, to gather insights or analytics, but typically you're aggregating, transforming, cleaning the data so that you have an output that's easy to stand up a dashboard, run analytics, and do other things against that. Now, the Spark engine itself, it's Apache Spark. It's an open source engine, but out of the box, it supports, I think, like PySpark, which is a Python language version. There's Scala, I'm not sure the proper way to pronounce that. There's Spark SQL. So there's a few languages, but there's not native support for like C# and F#. So what the .NET for Spark project does is it provides a C# or F#. It provides a .NET experience for building what's called Spark jobs, or these pieces of functionality that interact with the data. And there's a few things it does. It mimics the API. So what you would get from writing something in Scala, whatever, you get from .NET. So you get the different types of commands, the different types of filters and aggregates, etc. And it enables that experience. But the beautiful thing is, because it's .NET, you can now tap into existing project libraries. So you're not just limited by Python libraries, and not that those are limiting, but I'm saying if you've already built an analytics engine that you want to use in .NET, you can include that as a reference. The other really nice thing that comes out of this is the ability to use C# and F# in notebooks. So I don't know if you're familiar with Jupyter notebooks, or like we have Synapse Studio notebooks, but this allows you to connect to a data source and use C# or F# to explore the data source interactively and gain insights and experiment with ways that maybe you're learning how to build that Spark job that you want to build, so to speak.
You touched on so many things there. One of the couple of things that came out. So I'm working with ML.NET right now, and one of the things that in TensorFlow, which actually ML.NET leverages TensorFlow.NET for something, but also in Pandas.NET and NumPy.NET, all of those seem to be basically straight ports of the TensorFlow API to C#. I mean, in fact, if you look at them side by side, the code's almost identical. And the thing is, the TensorFlow API is written for Python developers.
Right.
And if you just port that over, you're going to have C# developers trying to write C# in a Pythonic style, and that just doesn't work. Whereas ML.NET takes it and puts things into a .NET style, a more object-oriented style. And so that, so when you have something like .NET for Spark, it seems like that's another thing that you're trying to accomplish, is giving them, talk about being able to tap into your existing code and everything. And then the other thing you were talking about is the notebooks. In fact, I believe Jeff Fritz has been doing some introductory tutorials on C# on his stream, in which he's actually using notebooks with C#, or at least a notebook-like experience. So lots of lots of good stuff. Yeah, notebooks. In fact, we have Sarah Dekavich, who's going to be doing a talk about Jupyter Notebooks with Python at TDevConf.
Well, there's I'll just add really quickly, there's a Code magazine is coming out with a issue coming up that I've written an article that covers .NET for Spark as well as ML.NET and shows how the two can work together. So keep an eye out for that, because I think especially for people like me, who I wasn't doing much in that space before I came here and learned a ton, I think that'll open up some eyes onto what's possible with just a very small amount of code to do some pretty amazing things.
Oh yeah. And then also, I was looking at the schedule and remembered that Ron Dagdag is actually going to be doing a talk about Jupyter Notebook and .NET at TDevConf. So hopefully, people can check that out. One last question here. One last question before we get to the commercial and then your final comments. But what do you do outside of tech? It sounds like you're really busy. So what you mentioned your side projects that you've been working on. But what do you do outside of work and tech?
Sure. So it's been an interesting year for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Lots been going on. In February, when I found out that I had this new role, .NET Data PM, I was accepted for it. That same week, I was also diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's disease.
Oh, no.
And I had a tremor basically in my arm, and I went and saw 7 different doctors before they were able to make the diagnosis. But what's interesting is for Parkinson's disease, in a nutshell, basically what happens is cells that produce dopamine in your brain start to die. And dopamine is what connects brain cells together, so the signals get mixed up, and then you get things like tremors and losing sensation, etc. I have very mild symptoms, and since my diagnosis, they've improved multiple times. But one of the interesting things is, scientifically, there's only one thing that has been proven to slow the progression of Parkinson's, and that's continual intense exercise combined with a quality diet. And I already follow a plant-based diet. So this was an impetus, and I've already been training consistently, but I kind of knocked my training up a notch. So outside of coding, I focus on my training. I do that pretty intensely most days a week. I'm very into hiking. Part of why I moved to the Pacific Northwest from Atlanta, Georgia area, was so that I could take advantage of all the hiking opportunities. I'm into virtual reality. And then there's so many places to explore in the area. My wife and I just like to take dates on the weekend and drive out to the islands, or find a new hike, or find a new coffee shop to hang out at. So that's really what I do, and working in my garden. So we've got a backyard where we can now grow things, and so that's pretty exciting too.
Awesome. Well, I want to get your final thoughts in just a minute, but first of all, I do want to remind everybody that TDevConf is Saturday, October 3rd, 2020. You can see Jeremy and all the other great speakers that we're going to have. Get your free tickets at bit.ly/TDevConf2020-tickets. Find us on the web. Find the schedule at TDevConf2020-schedule, and follow us on Twitter at TDevConf. Jeremy, leave us with some words of wisdom, sir.
I think words of wisdom in my head right now, because I'm wrapping up this project that I've been working on for months for this link translation, is, as a developer, experience is important. And I have a piece of advice. I'd love for you to come see the talk and learn about expressions, but if I can leave wisdom for anyone who may or may not be interested, it's always start with the experience you want and work backwards from that. So if you're designing an API, and I do this all the time and it works really well, think of what is the ideal way to access that API. And I'm pretty sure going through 500 steps is never what's ideal, right? My goal was I want to be able to run a query from the client on the server with as few lines of code as possible. And there's just 2 lines. There's a config line in the server, a config line in the client, and then you write your query. It took months to work backwards from that goal, but early on in my career, one of my mentors gave me this piece of advice, which is it takes a lot of technology to create the illusion of simplicity. But that should be our goal as developers, is to make it not just so that people know when they fail, but to make it really difficult, if not impossible, for them to fail. Those are my parting thoughts.
All right. Sounds good. My guest this morning has been Mr. Jeremy Likness from Microsoft. Jeremy, again, thank you for helping to make TDevConf awesome. We're looking forward to it.
I am too. Thank you.
All right. See you later, everybody. Thanks.